Tonight's presentation, can't sign it off, question mark. Our presenter, Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's author for numerous aviation publications and longtime presenter for EAA webinars on a monthly basis. Mike is a CFI, he's an A&P mechanic with IA privilege. 2008, he's FAA's Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year and a member of EAA. Mike, thank you so much. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I guess it's evening most places. And thanks for coming. The title of this webinar is Can't Sign It Off, but I actually thought I might, maybe a better title would be Wrongfully Imprisoned. It's an interesting story. It had a happy ending, but it didn't have a happy beginning. But it's something that recently happened to an aircraft owner that I think a lot of lessons can be learned from. And basically the question that we're going to address here is, can a mechanic who works on your plane then refuse to sign it off? Or can he refuse to put it back together after he's taken it apart? And that's kind of interesting. But at any rate, the story involves an aircraft owner who I will call Mark. That's his real name, but we'll call him Mark tonight. And he's flying his Cirrus turbo normalized SR-22 over northern New England. He was headed for home in the DC area on what he expected to be his last flight prior to putting the airplane in the shop for its 2024 annual. He normally has his annuals done at a shop in Pennsylvania, and he's based near DC. And at any rate, he's flying over northern New England, headed for home, and suddenly the engine started running very rough, like change of underwear rough. And he looked at the engine page on his multifunction display and saw that the number 2 cylinder head temperature was a lot higher than the others. It was above 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and it seemed to be rising rapidly. Mark had watched lots of good webinars on things like detonation and pre-ignition and stuff like that, and he realized that that cylinder was in the process of a thermal runaway. So he did exactly the right stuff. He immediately went full rich, and he throttled back the engine to stop the thermal runaway. Still running rougher in a cob, and he declared emergency with ATC and made a precautionary landing at a major airport up in northern New England. After an uneventful landing, other than underwear, he taxied to the FBO, which happened to have a large Part 145 repair station associated with it. And that repair station just happened to be a Cirrus authorized service center, which seemed like it was a lucky thing, so that hopefully they would know something about Cirruses. So he put the airplane in the shop. He had a conversation with the director of maintenance, told him about the very rough running engine that suddenly occurred overflying the airport, and the rising cylinder head temperature and the cylinder number 2 that he saw in the MFD. And he asked that the shop troubleshoot the issue and report back on its findings. So a few days later, Mark phoned the shop to see what they had found. And let's talk about for a second what they said that they found. So the director of maintenance told Mark that they had bore scoped the number 2 cylinder. It's a little difficult to do on a turbo normalized Cirrus because the number 2 cylinder is the left rear cylinder, and there's an intercooler kind of right in the way, so you have to remove the intercooler to get access, and you have to remove the top spark plug, stick a borescope in the cylinder. So they had done that. And they had determined that the number 2 cylinder had suffered detonation damage and would need to be replaced. And the director of maintenance explained that he came to the conclusion that it had sustained detonation damage because when they looked at it under the borescope, the exhaust valve appeared completely white. The director of maintenance went on to say that he believed that the cause of this detonation was that the left-hand turbocharger was leaking exhaust gas, and that he believed that leaking exhaust gas from the left-hand turbocharger, which is located down below the number 2 cylinder, was torching the number 2 cylinder with hot exhaust gases and causing it to go into detonation. He also said that the other turbocharger, the one on the right side, was leaking oil pretty badly, so he felt that actually both turbochargers would need to be removed and sent out for overhaul. So far we've got a bad cylinder and 2 bad turbochargers. He mentioned to Mark that they were having supply chain problems, which we kind of all know about in maintenance. It's that they got real bad after COVID and never seemed to quite get back to normal, and that both the cylinder work and turbocharger overhauls were taking an unusually long period of time to turn around. Because of the supply chain problems causing repair parts to be in short supply. Now, Mark was less concerned about the cost than he was about getting the airplane back home before the annual expired. So he told the shop that he was prepared to buy a new cylinder and 2 new turbochargers if that's what it was going to take to get this airplane flyable, so that he could fly back home. A few days later, the director of maintenance called Mark and said that they had found some more problems. They found cylinder head cracks in 2 other cylinders besides the number 2 cylinder. The cylinder head cracks were kind of the typical cracks that Continental cylinders often are found to have between the top spark plug and the fuel nozzle boss, the top spark plug boss, the fuel nozzle boss. And so those cylinders would have to be replaced too. So now we're up to 3 cylinders that need to be replaced, plus 2 turbochargers. Okay, now I'm going to stop telling you this story for a minute, and let's go through a little quiz on just what we've learned so far. So the first question is a white exhaust valve indicative of detonation damage? The answer is no. The exhaust deposits on exhaust valves can be almost any color: white, red, orange, yellow, brown, even green is normal. Green metal is not good, but green exhaust deposits are perfectly normal. But at any rate, the fact that the exhaust valve looked white under the borescope is certainly not a valid indication of detonation damage. And why the shop thought it was is I don't know, but it was clearly wrong. So the second question is, if you were looking for detonation damage in a cylinder, where would you look? Where would you find the signatures that would indicate that detonation damage had occurred? And the answer, if you think about it, is pretty obvious. You would look at the aluminum parts of the combustion chamber, the ones that would be subject to melting if there was a thermal runaway in the cylinder. Exhaust valve obviously is not going to melt. Anything made of steel is not going to melt. The primary place we look for detonation signatures is on the piston crown, and if the detonation is real light, which really doesn't hurt anything, all we see is that the piston crown looks pretty clean. The normal deposit formation is pretty much it's pretty much gone. If the detonation is moderate or heavy, then we start seeing little impact craters on the piston crown that kind of look like somebody beat it with a ball-peen hammer. And what those actually are little craters where the aluminum melted because the detonation shock waves disturbed the boundary layer and allowed the aluminum to, in isolated locations, to get above the melting point of aluminum. And so you start seeing these little craters that look like somebody beat on the piston. And if it gets bad enough, then you start seeing the corners of the piston starting to melt, and molten aluminum runs down and it gets into the compression rings and seizes the compression rings, and pretty much the cylinder then winds up going to zero compression, and the thermal runaway shuts down by itself. Thermal runaway always, if the pilot doesn't arrest it, it's always going to stop by itself, but only after quite a bit of aluminum has melted and the cylinder is pretty much destroyed, and sometimes the aluminum gets into other things and does bad things. But at any rate, if you're looking for detonation, you wouldn't be looking at the exhaust valve, you'd be looking at the piston. We can also see detonation signatures on the cylinder head, the aluminum part of the cylinder head. But the primary place we look for them is on the piston. But if you're looking for detonation signatures, you want to look at something made of aluminum, not something made of steel. It obviously isn't going to be melting. So the next question is, could a leak in the turbocharger, this turbocharger that's down below the number 2 cylinder, if it was leaking exhaust gas, could that cause the cylinder to detonate? Well, to be honest, I've never seen that happen, but I suppose theoretically it could, but not before it started melting the cooling fins and stuff on the cylinder head that are made of aluminum. And there was no melting, no melted fins or any kind of fin damage observed. So not only don't we have any valid evidence of detonation damage in cylinder number 2, but we also don't have any indication that the turbocharger exhaust leak was actually causing a problem. I mean, if it was leaking enough, it probably needs to be dealt with, but it does not seem in any way to be related to why Mark's engine was running rough. And he mentioned the other turbocharger was leaking oil and that it would need to be overhauled. And the question is, does turbocharger leaking oil indicate that there's a problem with the turbocharger? And the answer is no. If the turbocharger is leaking oil on the ground, which I think is what was the case here, it means that the check valve that prevents oil from backfeeding into the turbocharger after you shut the engine down is probably not closing properly. And that's a very common problem, that the check valve will start to leak and you'll start seeing oil leaking out of the tailpipe from the turbocharger, and you need to go in and replace the check valve. If the oil was leaking in flight, which I don't think was the case here because the shop would have had no way of knowing oil was leaking from the turbocharger in flight since they didn't fly the airplane. But oil leaking from a turbocharger in flight indicates a problem with the scavenge pump, which is a pump mounted on the back of the engine that pulls oil out of the turbocharger. If it's not pulling oil out of the turbocharger properly, then the turbocharger is going to leak oil while the engine's running. But in this case, I think that any oil leakage that the shop was seeing would have been from a leaky exhaust valve. I mean, a leaky check valve on that for the right-hand turbocharger. And again, clearly this was not in any way related to the rough running engine. It might have been a valid discrepancy, and it might have been something that ought to have been dealt with at annual, but it didn't have anything to do with why the engine was running rough. So we'll talk about these cylinder cracks. Can the cylinder head crack in this area between the top spark plug boss and the fuel nozzle, which is quite common on Continental cylinders. Can such a crack cause engine roughness? And the answer is no, there's no way it can cause engine roughness. In fact, typically 50% of the time we see shops reporting cracks in this area, it turns out that they're not really cracks, they're just casting flaws. And we always do a dye penetrance inspection to see if the crack has any appreciable depth, and at least half the time the crack just disappears when you do a dye penetrant inspection. But even legitimate cracks in this area that are real, although they technically render the cylinder unairworthy, that they've never caused any mischief. They've never caused any symptoms. There's never been a accident or incident or anything caused by cracks in this area. They're completely benign, although they're, they one can argue that they would technically make the cylinder unairworthy. That's not even 100% clear. In my experience, any crack in that area that's not actually leaking fuel and stained blue is just kind of a non-event that you don't really have to worry about. Okay, so the next question is, well, why was the shop looking at all this stuff? Did Mark ask the shop to perform an inspection of his aircraft? And the answer is no, he didn't. He asked the shop to investigate why the engine was running rough. And they clearly went way beyond the scope of their authority and started looking at all sorts of things that couldn't possibly have had anything to do with the engine running rough. Did the shop in New England actually diagnose the cause of the engine roughness? And I think it's pretty clear at this point that no, they didn't. They weren't even close. They weren't on the right track. He said he saw a high CHT on cylinder number 2. They immediately focused on cylinder number 2, and they immediately decided cylinder number 2 was sick and would have to come off. And I think there was a lot of confirmation bias there that they were looking for a problem in cylinder number 2, and by God, they decided they found one, but they actually weren't anywhere close to being on the right track of why the engine was running rough. So why was it running rough? Well, we'll get to that. Let's go back to the story. So at any rate, Mark at this point decides to call for help. He's getting profoundly uncomfortable with what was going on in the shop, where he kept getting phone calls and more things were going to have to get replaced, and he didn't really have a lot of confidence that the shop was on the right track. And he remembered that he had subscribed to Savvy's breakdown assistance service, and he thought it might not be a bad idea to ask for help. Now, when people subscribe to Savvy's breakdown assistance service, we always ask them that if they have some kind of a mechanical problem on the road, the first thing they should do is call us. Don't put the airplane in the shop, call us. About half the time people call in with problems on the road, we're able to solve the problems over the phone without getting a mechanic involved. And if we do have to get a mechanic involved, we want to make sure that the mechanics are doing the stuff that needs to be done and are on the right track. But at any rate, he didn't call us until this point, where the shop had dug into his engine and found all sorts of things that they didn't like, and were telling him he's going to have to replace 3 cylinders and 2 turbochargers. And so I guess better late than never. So at any rate, he called the hotline. Within a couple minutes, he got a call back from Tom Cooper, who is one of our most senior account managers, a very long time ANPIA. And Tom said, what's going on? And Mark briefed him on his in-flight emergency, where the engine was running real rough and the CHT was running away, and he made a precautionary landing and asked the FBO to troubleshoot the problem. And he described everything that had happened since then and his various conversations with the director of maintenance. And of course, by the time he was done telling Tom what was going on, Tom was profoundly uncomfortable with what was going on at the FBO as well. So Tom says to Mark, instruct the shop to stop work immediately. He said they're clearly on a fishing expedition, and to try to find every discrepancy they possibly can with the aircraft, and we just can't let them do that. We need to get your airplane home. So at any rate, Tom gets in contact with the director of maintenance and introduces himself as, you know, AMPIA who works for Savvy, and asks him to post they opened a ticket on our trouble ticket system, asked him to post the borescope images, reviewed the borescope images. He didn't think there was anything abnormal, but just to be on the safe side, he asked several other members of the Savvy team to review the images, and including me, and we all agreed that there wasn't anything about the borescope images that suggested detonation damage. Tom asked the director of maintenance about what the piston crown looked like. The director of maintenance didn't have any images of it, but he said that they looked at it and it looked normal. He asked the director of maintenance about the condition of the spark plugs, because if a cylinder goes into destructive detonation, it's very likely that the spark plug insulators, the ceramic nose core insulators, will be fractured by the shock waves of the detonation. And the shop confirmed that the spark plugs also looked normal. Tom was able to get Mark to download his engine monitor data, upload it to our platform, and asked one of our senior data analysts, Stephanie, who's also an AMPIA, to review the data. Stephanie looked at it, reported back that the cylinder head temperature for cylinder number 2 never exceeded 429 Fahrenheit, which is, you know, hotter than we would want it to run, but not hot enough to cause any damage. And it was clear that Mark had reacted quickly enough to this problem by going full rich and throttling back that he stopped the thermal runaway before any damage could be done. And also the fact that there was really no significant abnormality in the EGT at the same time that would suggest that detonation was going on. So we were pretty sure that there was no detonation going on in this cylinder. And Tom concluded that the shop really did never find any valid evidence of detonation, and that this business about the white exhaust valve indicating detonation was just a red herring. Then Tom asked the director of maintenance, you know, why they were concerned about the cracks in the other cylinders, since that didn't seem to have anything to do with the rough running engine either. The director of maintenance said that these cylinders with the cracks were unairworthy, and he cited the Continental Service Bulletin MSB 09-1B that addressed cracked cylinder heads. Well, when you look at that service bulletin, you know, Tom had a number of problems with the shop's position on this. First of all, it's a service bulletin. Mark has no obligation to comply with the service bulletin. And the service bulletin, if you read it, applies to one batch of 300 cylinders that came out of Mobile. And none of Mark's cylinders were in that batch. So the service bulletin didn't even apply to Mark's cylinders. The head cracks in this particular area are ones that are very common. We see them all the time. And like I said, about half of the time that mechanics report cracks in that area, when you die penetrate them, they aren't really cracks. They're just artifacts of the casting. And even when the cracks are real, they've never caused any kind of an in-flight failure or incident accident. They're just a technical airworthiness issue, perhaps, but they aren't a safety issue. They've never caused any kind of a problem. There are cracks in other areas that we take a lot more seriously, but cracks in this particular area just aren't serious. And finally, and most importantly, these head cracks were clearly totally unrelated to the engine roughness that Mark asked the shop to investigate, and why they were off looking at all these cylinders for head cracks is, just seems like they were going, way outside of the envelope of what Mark asked them to do. So now the problem was, how are we going to get Mark's airplane out of this shop and get it home? So Tom asked the director of maintenance how much disassembly the shop had done so far, because he'd asked him to stop work. Now he asked him, okay, where do we stand? And the shop indicated that they'd removed the cowling, they removed the left-hand intercooler to get access to the cylinder number 2 top spark plug. They removed the top spark plugs from all of the cylinders because they were off looking for head cracks. And I think they might have removed an induction tube from the cylinder number 2, because they were sort of preparing to remove the cylinder when Tom told them to stop. But they hadn't gotten all that far. They hadn't taken that much stuff apart. And the good news was that the cylinder had not been removed. The turbochargers had not been removed. This was all good news, because clearly none of this stuff had anything to do with the problem. So at this point, Tom told the director of maintenance of the shop that Mark wanted the shop to put the airplane back together in flyable condition and get it out of the shop. Surprisingly, the director of maintenance response to that request was, "We can't sign off the airplane in that condition. It is not airworthy." Well, that was a big red flag for Tom. So Tom decided that he was going to give the director of maintenance a little re-education on this. And he indicated that the director of maintenance did not have any authority to withhold his signature from a logbook entry under this circumstance. And he explained that the regulation that states requirement for making logbook entries, which is FAR 43.9, requires that any person who performs maintenance to describe the work performed in a maintenance record, and then to sign the entry with his certificate number and type to signify that the work that was performed was done satisfactorily. If you work on an airplane, you don't have an option not to make a logbook entry. Now, there are 2 different kinds of logbook entries. If you're doing an inspection, like say an annual inspection, then you have to make a logbook entry and sign it too. But there's 2 different kinds of logbook entries you can make. One that says the aircraft is airworthy, and one that says it's unairworthy. The second kind we called signing off an annual with discrepancies. But he wasn't doing, he wasn't hired to do an inspection, and he wasn't doing an inspection. He was doing presumably a repair. And so the 43.9, there's only one kind of 43.9 entry, and it always requires a signature, and it doesn't include a statement as to airworthiness or not. On a 43.9 entry, the signature does not mean the aircraft is unairworthy or airworthy. It just means that the work that was memorialized in the logbook entry was done properly. So in this case, the only maintenance the shop did was to remove the left-hand intercooler and some spark plugs and then reinstall them. And they were required by regulation to make a maintenance entry saying, "I removed and reinstalled the intercooler and the spark plugs," and sign that entry. They don't have the option to not sign off the entry. So at any rate, the director of maintenance realized that he was wrong and that Tom was right, that he didn't have the option not to sign off a logbook entry. So he decided to switch tactics, and he said, "Okay, we're not willing to put the airplane back together." So that also was something Tom didn't expect. And he was quite adamant, the director of maintenance was quite adamant that they had taken Mark's airplane apart, but they were not willing to put it back together. So Tom decided to call the FSDO. Now, normally we would never get the FAA involved, but in this case, the FAA was this whole thing was already on the FAA's radar screen because Mark had declared an emergency. And anytime you declare an emergency, ATC has to advise the FSDO, and the FSDO has to contact the pilot and ask for a statement, and they have to fill out a bunch of paperwork. So the fact that Mark had this rough running engine and had put the airplane in the shop here was something that was already on the FSDO's radar screen. So he figured nothing to be lost by calling the FAA. So Tom had an interesting conversation with the FSDO. He first spoke to the principal maintenance inspector who had responsibility for oversight of this particular repair station. And then subsequently, the principal maintenance inspector kicked it upstairs to his boss. So Tom talked to the FSDO manager. And both of those guys were extremely sympathetic with Mark's plight. They were not very happy that the shop had said that they were not going to put Mark's airplane back together. But very apologetically, they explained to Tom that there wasn't anything they could do about it because there is no regulation that requires a shop to perform any work that it doesn't want to do. And in particular, there's no regulation that requires a shop that has taken something apart to put it back together. This is actually not a situation that I think we'd ever encountered before in 16 years of doing this. But it turns out that there's nothing the FAA can do. If a shop takes an airplane apart and refuses to put it back together, I mean, I think that's highly unethical, but it's not a violation of any FAA regulation. So this was sort of a sticky wicket, and it became clear at this point to Tom that the only way out of this situation was going to be that we would have to bring in an outside mechanic, an outside A&P, to put Mark's airplane back together so he could fly it home because the shop was not willing to put it back together. And there was a whole bunch of back and forth with the shop that was very unpleasant because we said, could we put the airplane out on the ramp so that a mechanic can work on it? No, you can't do maintenance on the ramp. And could we have an outside mechanic come into your shop and do the work? Well, maybe, but we would have to have somebody supervise him, and we would bill you for the time that we spent supervising him at shop rates. It was just a ridiculous discussion. But in any event, we ultimately decided we were going to have to bring in an outside mechanic. Mark contacted a bunch of independent A&Ps in this area, and then each one initially indicated that they were willing to help, but then they called the director of maintenance at the shop, and then they called back and said, no, we don't want to get into the middle of this fight. We're not willing to touch the airplane because the director of maintenance doesn't want it to be put back together. And so there were a lot of kind of local politics in the area. And ultimately, it turned out that Tom, who is based in Florida, he's actually Canadian, and he was on his way driving up the East Coast in his RV, Tom and his wife, to take a vacation in Canada. And so his RV route was going to take him, up through New England. So he decided, well, look, I'll just stop by and put the airplane back together, which again is something we don't usually do, but this was a really unusual situation. So any rate, Tom did go up there and he put the airplane back together, put the intercoolers back on and the spark plugs back in, and cowled everything up. And then Tom and Mark climbed in the airplane, started the engine and taxied out to the run-up area to perform a pre-flight run-up to see, what the engine was doing. And when they did the pre-flight mag check and they switched to the right mag, the engine quit. That was a little unexpected. So Tom removed the top cowling and removed the vent plug from the right magneto. As it happened, this airplane had a SureFly in place of the left magneto, an electronic ignition system, but had a conventional Bendix S20 tractor mag in the right one, and that's the one that wasn't working. So he took the vent plug off the top of the mag so he could look inside the mag and look at the distributor gear. And then when he rotated the prop, discovered that the distributor gear wasn't turning. So clearly some teeth had sheared off the distributor gear. He also observed that the distributor gear was quite yellowed in color, which usually means that it's quite long in the tooth. And normally when they get that color, we want to replace them. And the mag had only come out of a 500-hour IRAN only 100 hours prior, but it turned out the IRAN was not done by a mag specialty shop. The mag wasn't sent out for that. It was just a local mechanic at Mark's local shop that had done the 500-hour, and obviously he had not decided to replace this distributor gear that failed. And interestingly, Mark said that he had experienced a similar failure of distributor gear 3 times in the past, and that he was so disgusted with these mags that one of the things that he'd planned to do during the upcoming annual inspection was to put a SureFly on the right side to get rid of the mags once and for all, because SureFly was now approved for replacing both mags, not just one mag. But at any rate, so this was clearly the reason that his engine had started running rough. It was a bad mag that sheared a distributor gear. And if you think about it, when that happens, what happens is the mag keeps making sparks, but instead of the sparks being directed to the correct cylinder, they're all going to one cylinder. It's probably number 2. And so what happened in number 2 was obviously a pre-ignition event that was induced by this mag that had sheared its distributor gear, and had pre-ignition events are quite violent. So if Mark hadn't been on his toes and hadn't throttled back so quickly, the chances are that cylinder would have been destroyed. The piston would have been melted. But he reacted very quickly, which was good. He knew exactly what to do under those circumstances, and kind of saved the day. But at any rate, that's what caused the roughness, was a mag failure, and the shop was, off looking at cylinder problems which had nothing to do with the engine roughness. And so, question is, well, why didn't the shop find this? And the answer is because they never ran the engine. Mark brought him the airplane. The first thing that happens, he pulled it in the hangar and started taking things apart, which is something that we see a lot. If you have a problem, the first thought should not be, let's attack it with tools. The first thought should be, let's gather as much diagnostic data as we can to figure out what's wrong. But the shop was, it seems pretty elementary that if you have a rough running engine, the first thing you're going to try to do is run up the engine and gather some data. But they never did that. So they were, going up a blind alley. Would have been a very expensive blind alley. And then after they did all this work and replaced 3 cylinders and 2 turbochargers and all that stuff, and they would take it out for a run up, and it it would clear they hadn't fixed the problem, $15,000 later. So ultimately, Tom arranged for an overhauled mag to be installed. We asked the shop if we provided them a mag, whether they'd install it. They said, no, we're not going to touch this airplane. They were really pretty spiteful at that point. So we got somebody to put the overhauled mag on the airplane. Now, by this time, all this stuff had been going on. The annual had expired, so we had to go to the FSDO and get a ferry permit so that Mark could get his airplane home on a ferry permit. But at any rate, he ultimately was able to fly it home. So that's the story. Let's talk about a couple of lessons learned and then open it up for a little Q&A. I think that these lessons are really something that applies anytime an aircraft owner faces, unplanned maintenance away from home. And the first lesson is you need to keep the shop on a very short leash. You have to tell them exactly what you want them to do. And Mark did. He said, I would like you to investigate the reason for the rough running engine. But you got to make sure that they don't exceed the scope of that and go off on a fishing expedition, which is clearly what the shop was doing. They were acting as if this was an annual inspection, and they were just trying to find anything that they could find that was a discrepancy, whether or not it had any relevance to the rough running engine, which is what Mark was concerned about. You need to give the shop precise instructions on what you want them to do, and make it explicitly clear that they're not authorized to go beyond the scope of what you're asking them to do. And most owners are not terribly good at doing that, but it's really important to keep the scope of the work that the shop does very tightly confined. You never want to give the shop a blank check. You always want to give them a maximum number of hours or dollars that they're authorized to expend. So if, for example, if you're putting the airplane in the shop and asking them to troubleshoot something, if you just say troubleshoot them, that's pretty much a blank check. If you say, I'm authorizing you to spend up to 2 hours of labor to investigate the cause, and at the end of the 2 hours, whether you found it or not, I want you to call me back and report your findings. Then at that point, then you're putting good constraint on what they can do. But if you just say go troubleshoot the problem, which is essentially what Mark did, then you just don't have any assurance that they won't run up a big bill and go off doing things that aren't particularly helpful. And most of all, you have to make sure that the shop understands you're not authorizing them to perform an airworthiness inspection, and you're not asking them to make an airworthiness determination. That you're really not interested in their opinion on whether the aircraft's airworthy or not. You're only interested in them fixing the particular problem that you're asking them to fix. Make it clear that your objective is to make the airplane safe to fly home, not to make it technically airworthy. When you put it in for an annual inspection, then you have to make it technically airworthy. But in this case, all he was interested in is making it safe to fly home. And it's really important to understand, and I've mentioned this many times before on previous webinars, that the regulations only require you to have a mechanic make an airworthiness determination once a year. And the other 364 days a year, the responsibility for determining airworthiness lies with the pilot in command. So one day a year, it's an IA that makes that determination, and 364 days a year, it's it's the pilot in command that makes that determination. And so, you know, this is a distinction between, the regs are very clear about the distinction between inspections and non-inspections. And that's why, in fact, there are two regulations having to do with maintenance record entry. 43.9 talks about non-inspections, and 43.11 talks about inspections. And the rules are very different. The meaning of the signature is very different. The signature on a 43.11 entry, which is what you get when you have an annual inspection done, it either says, I find the airplane to be in airworthy condition, or I don't. A 43.9 entry, which is any entry other than for an inspection, simply has a signature on it that says, here's the work I did, and I did it in a satisfactory fashion. And there's no determination of airworthiness involved in doing that. But this shop clearly was in a mindset of airworthiness, which is not what you want when you have a breakdown on the road. So at any rate, this was particularly unfortunate and unusual story, but I thought that they brought up a lot of interesting issues, and there were a lot of lessons learned on how to deal with this stuff so that it doesn't get out of control in the way that it happened for Mark. And with that, Tim, why don't we open it up for some Q&A?
All right, Mike, thanks. We got some questions in here. Jerry, just wondering, did the director of maintenance ever put anything in the logbook?
You know, that's a good question. I suspect that he did, because I think Tom bludged him into doing it. He didn't put much in the logbook, and he knew if he put anything in the logbook that talked about airworthiness, we were going to send it back. And we also told Mark, he said, if this guy puts anything, derogatory about your airplane in this logbook entry, then just take the logbook entry on a sticky, and put it in a file somewhere, and after 12 months, throw it out, because the FAA only requires that 43.9 entries be kept for a maximum of 12 months. And there's no regulation that says you have to paste it in the book. And so if somebody, if a shop gives us a bad logbook entry that has inappropriate stuff in it or inaccurate stuff in it or something, we normally will send it back to the shop for a do-over. But if the shop, is stubborn or belligerent or something like this shop was, then we don't fight that battle. We just say, okay, take the bad logbook entry, stick it somewhere, but not in the book, and then after a year, toss it, because it's just an inappropriate entry. And again, the FAA, you're not allowed to, for example, alter a logbook entry, or take a black magic marker and get rid of the stuff you don't like in it or something. But you can toss it out after 12 months, because the FAA only requires that maintenance record entries be retained for a maximum of 12 months, except for certain entries having to do with AD compliance and stuff have to be kept indefinitely. But the majority of maintenance record entries, including 43.9 entries for repairs and 43.11 entries even for annual inspections, you don't even have to keep a record of any annual inspection other than the last one. Now, I don't suggest that you willy-nilly start throwing out logbook entries, because if you ever want to sell your airplane, the prospective buyer is probably going to want to see a complete set of records. But the FAA doesn't require that you keep the records more than 12 calendar months, or until the work that is described in the maintenance record entry is repeated. So, technically, if you do an oil change and make a maintenance record entry on the oil change, you can throw out all prior maintenance record entries involving oil changes. I wouldn't suggest you do that, but it's important to know that you can. The retention rules, which is FAR 91417, basically talks about what maintenance record entries an owner is required to keep and how long they're required to keep them. And the retention length on most maintenance record entries is 1 year or until the work described is repeated.
A few people typed in, were wondering, did Cirrus take any action against the shop?
No, we've not. We didn't complain to Cirrus, and I don't think the owner complained to Cirrus. And you know, I don't really understand. And actually, this particular shop, that I'm not going to mention who it is, but we had actually worked with that shop before on other airplanes, and we had not had any bad experiences. They just somehow went off the rails on this one. This was very, very unusual.
Chris was wondering, would it be appropriate to maintain 2 logbooks, one for the short term, say 12-month records, and one for long-term entries like AD compliance?
Well, I mean, you certainly can, or there's no reason you can't maintain. I mean, my logbooks used to be in a loose leaf binder. And nowadays I don't even keep logbooks. I keep them all in the cloud electronically. And you know, and if I ever got crosswise with the FAA and they asked me to see the maintenance records on my airplane, I would give them exactly the maintenance records that 91-417 requires me to keep. Not to say I'd throw them out, but you know, I don't need to disclose them to anybody.
Donald wonders, as an A&P, if you replace an oil pump, is a note such as quote unquote, as returned to service needed? And does this mean the aircraft is airworthy?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is that no such statement is required. I call them magic words. And in the case of, again, there are 2 fundamentally different kinds of logbook entries, and we call them 43.9 entries and 43.11 entries because those are the 2 regulations that describe what is required to be in them. 43.11 entries are for required inspections. For most of us, that's just an annual inspection, but you'd make a 43.11 entry for an annual inspection. There are 4 kinds of inspections: annual inspection, 100-hour inspections, progressive inspections, and special inspections. Special inspection is, for example, an inspection that is required by an AD. That might be a repetitive inspection that's required at some interval. But the entries, maintenance record entries that describe one of those 4 kinds of required inspections are 43.11 entries. And they have to have a set of magic words in them. And there's actually 2 alternative sets of magic words, and the exact phrasing of the magic words are right in the regulation. And it says, you know, if you do the inspection and find that the thing you're inspecting is airworthy, in the case of an annual, it's the whole airplane. You find it airworthy, then you use 1 set of magic words. It's, you know, I certify that I have inspected this aircraft in accordance with an annual inspection and have determined it to be in airworthy condition. And if if it flunks the inspection, then there's a 2nd set of magic words, and those magic words are also written in the reg. 43.9 entries, which is for anything other than one of those 4 kinds of inspections, they have no magic words. No magic words are required. And the reg says specifically that the signature, first of all, it describes the signature. It's a signature by a person authorized to sign that entry. It depends on what work was done, who's authorized to sign it. But the signature on a 43.9 maintenance entry what the reg says is the signature constitutes approval for return to service only for the work performed. That's, I think, an exact quote from the reg. So the first half of that sentence says the signature constitutes approval for return to service. So that means no magic words are required. The signature alone constitutes the approval for return to service. You don't have to say, I approve it for return to service, because just by signing it, you've approved it for return to service. And the second part, which is really important, is only for the work performed, which means your approval for return to service is not an approval of the whole airplane. It's only an approval with regard to the work you performed, which is the work that's described in the logbook entry. You know, and the example I always use in IOA seminars, I've mentioned it before, is somebody brings an airplane into you and it's got a flat tire and the left wing is missing. And the owner says, would you please change the flat tire? So you change the flat tire, you make a 43.9 entry. It describes that you change the flat tire, you know, that you installed a Michelin Air 600/6, whatever it is, and then you sign it off. And then you mention to the owner, oh, by the way, I couldn't help but notice that the left wing was missing, and if I were you, I probably wouldn't fly the airplane in that condition. But you don't write anything in the logbook entry about the left wing being missing, because all you were hired to do is replace the tire. Now, if the same owner came to you with that same airplane with a flat right tire and a missing left wing, and he asked you to do an annual inspection, now it's a whole different kettle of fish, because now you're being asked to make an airworthiness determination of the aircraft, and you're obviously not going to sign off an annual as airworthy with a missing left wing. So you're either going to talk him into letting you replace the missing left wing, or you're going to sign off the annual as unairworthy. You have to sign off the annual, but you can sign it off in one of two ways: pass or fail. 43.9 entries, there aren't two ways to sign off. You have to sign them off. Anytime you do work, you've got to describe the work and sign it off. And the signature is only approving the aircraft for return to service with respect to the work that you performed, not anything outside the scope of what you performed. Now, this is something that's not thoroughly understood by a lot of A&Ps as to what their signature means, but the signature on an annual or 100-hour inspection, or even a special inspection that's, you know, mandated by AD or something, has a totally different meaning than the signature on a normal entry for an oil change or a tire change or any other kind of repair.
B says any work, whatever it is, should be put in writing. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's correct. Well, I'll put it this way: any work that qualifies as maintenance needs to be described in a maintenance record entry. That's what the reg requires. It requires a description of the work performed. Now the reg isn't very specific about how detailed that description should be. So, you know, a lot of mechanics will write a very general description that says, you know, I replaced the alternator or something. When I make entries, I tend to put lots of stuff in the entry about, you know, the alternator part number, the alternator serial number, and I might even make some comment about how long the previous alternator lasted before it failed or something. The reg doesn't specify how detailed or general that description of the work performed has to be. It just says a description of the work performed. Now, for AD compliance, the reg's very specific about exactly what you have to keep track of. But for most things, it's really up to the mechanic how detailed or general a description he wants to put in the entry. It just the reg just says you have to describe the work you performed, and then you have to sign it off.
Jerry wonders, had Mark done a mag check in flight, he would have found the bad mag. Then there's the decision to keep flying or not. Could you expand a little bit your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and this is a subject I have also talked about before in previous webinars. Um, it, we've seen quite a few of these failures of distributed gear failures, and actually Mark had seen 2 prior ones himself in his own airplane. And in all of the years I've been paying attention to this stuff, which is a lot, I have never once seen a pilot try to fault isolate the problem to a bad mag by doing an in-flight mag check. And you're right. Had Mark had the presence of mind to do a quick, left right both check in the air, and he would have discovered. We now know he would have discovered that when he switched to the left mag, the engine would stop running rough, and then he could make a decision as to whether he wanted to fly home that way. And it's, exactly what the best decision would be is, I mean, I would probably not fly all the way from New England to DC on one mag, but it's really up to the PIC to make that decision. But he wouldn't have declared emergency. It wouldn't have gotten on the FAA's radar screen, and it wouldn't. And then when he brought it into the shop, he would have said, "Hey, my right mag is not working properly," and he would have avoided all of this grief. But in all the time I've been following this, I've never once seen a pilot do that. Pilots, when they have a seriously rough running engine, don't think to do a mag check. I may think this might be some sort of an education problem that we have. But there's also, sort of a basic human nature thing in there that says, if your engine is running rough, the last thing you want to do is turn something off, And so I can kind of understand the psychology involved. But it is unfortunate, and I've seen this scenario play out with very, very experienced pilots, with student pilots, with pilots flying in a pattern, with the probably the most noteworthy one I remember. It happened years ago. It actually was a Cirrus, I'm pretty sure, a turbocharged Cirrus. He was actually up at the flight levels, and his engine started running rough as a cob. And he declared an emergency and made a landing at Cincinnati Lunken Airport, and it took him 30 minutes to get down from flight level, 230 or wherever the heck he was. He was up really high, and it took a long time to get down. And he literally had a half an hour to think about this. And in that half hour, he never tried to do a mag check on the way down. So it's a funny thing because the FAA knows that mags aren't terribly reliable, and that's why they require that we have 2 of them. That we have a fully redundant, theoretically a fully redundant electrical or ignition system, 2 mags, 2 harnesses, 2 sets of spark plugs in each cylinder. But that total redundancy doesn't help if you don't take advantage of it. And if a mag just quit dead, and there are certain failure modes where the mag just quits, and those are very benign. I mean, typically a pilot wouldn't even notice that one of the mags went off unless he happened to notice that his EGTs rose about 100 degrees. But the engine runs just fine on one mag, of course. We make sure it runs just fine on one mag. That's why we do a pre-flight mag check, to make sure that the engine's running fine on both mags individually. But there's a distinctively different failure mode, like the one that Mark experienced, where it's not that the mag quits, it's just that it goes berserk. And it's just extremely unusual for pilots to have the presence of mind to try to do a fault isolation when the magneto goes berserk. And I'm not sure why that is. I think we could probably do a better job of training pilots about that. It to me, it really ought to be kind of a memory checklist item. It's kind of like, you know, if you hear the stall warner, you're supposed to push the nose down. Now, human nature says you pull it up, but we all know that if you do that, you're going to die. And we get this stall warner, push the nose down stuff beat into our heads as student pilots until it becomes an automatic response. And you know, this is that same sort of thing. It seems to me that ought to be an automatic response, but it isn't. We don't train pilots to do this, and they almost never get it right. It's a good question. It's a really interesting situation, I think.
Joseph asks, if you declare an emergency with ATC, then troubleshoot the issue and figure it out, can you then cancel the emergency?
Well, you can certainly cancel the emergency, but I believe ATC is required if you declare an emergency to notify the FSDO, and I think the FSDO is required to file a report. So they're almost certainly you're going to get a phone call or an email from somebody at the FSDO basically asking you to make a statement about what happened, and usually it's nothing more than that. I mean, it's not anything to be concerned about. It's happened to me a couple times.
So Jeff has made a couple comments here. I think he's questioning. He's thinking maybe you're suggesting hiding. This is his question. Where in quote unquote ethics as an airplane owner and a mechanic, you hide work performed from an aircraft history. And then his follow-up, that you're saying you're talking about hiding maintenance from the logbooks. I don't think you're talking about hiding any maintenance from any logbooks, are you?
Well, I you know, look, it depends on the context. Why do we keep maintenance records? We keep maintenance records primarily to help mechanics, typically at the annual inspection, to be able to do research on IED compliance and things like that they're required to research. We keep them to make the FAA happy by complying with regulations, and we keep them to make prospective buyers happy when we go to sell the airplane. The regulation, you know, 91.417 says that any maintenance records that involve AD compliance, the kinds of things that mechanics need to research at each annual inspection, have to be kept indefinitely. They actually have to be kept more than indefinitely. They have to be kept indefinitely and transferred to the new owner if the airplane is sold. But it also says that the records of anything else only has to be kept for a year, or until that same work is performed again. And that sort of makes sense in a way, because the only annual inspection that counts is the most recent one. The FAA doesn't care about any annual inspections other than the most recent one. And really the only reason to keep maintenance records for more than a year is because you probably want to sell the airplane someday, or you might want to sell the airplane someday. And the prospective buyer would like more than what the FAA wants. But you know, the regulation sort of makes sense, and I'm not suggesting that you just willy-nilly start tossing maintenance records out after a year. I'm saying if you get an inappropriate maintenance record and you can't convince the shop to correct it, and to bring it into compliance with the regulation, then, you know, you either are in a protracted pissing contest with the shop, or you just say, okay, give me your stupid maintenance record, and I'll toss it once the FAA says it's okay to toss it. And you know, in this case, the shop was convinced that Mark's airplane was unairworthy. But frankly, the airworthiness of Mark's airplane was none of the shop's business, because Mark didn't ask them to do an inspection of the airplane. Mark didn't ask them to do an airworthiness determination. Mark wasn't required to have a mechanic do an airworthiness determination except for once a year. And he wasn't choosing this shop to do it. So the shop's opinion of the airworthiness of the airplane was completely irrelevant. Mark wasn't interested in it. And because it wasn't an inspection, the shop shouldn't say anything in the maintenance record entry about airworthiness. And if they do, then they're just making a gratuitous derogatory statement about the airplane. And I think Mark would be perfectly within his rights to toss it after a year, because it's just an inappropriate entry. So I mean, I'm not talking about hiding stuff. I'm just talking about how you deal with a situation that really should never happen. It's you know, it's really a shop that's misbehaving because somehow they think that they're allowed to do anything they want to on the airplane.
Steve wonders, can the airport or the facility block or not allow any mechanic access to the aircraft for required repairs?
Yeah, that can be a problem. That wasn't really a problem in this particular case. We've had situations like I remember we had an airplane that had an in-flight emergency and wind up landing at Atlanta Hartsfield, which has got to be like the worst place in the world to have a sick general aviation airplane. And you can imagine what the security things that are going on at an airport like at Atlanta Hartsfield, which is one of the busiest airline airports in the country. And it was very, very difficult to get a mechanic in there to fix it. We ultimately were able to do it, but it was a big problem.
Well, Mike, let's wrap it up here. Looks like we had about 500 people on tonight. So take a moment and share closing thoughts with us.
Okay, well, just very quickly, the usual stuff. If you are not on my email list for my monthly newsletter and other interesting things about war scopes and all that kind of stuff, easiest way to do it is to text the word SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777, or you can go to the Savvy Aviation website and sign up, or you can stick around for Tim's post maintenance survey, which I hope you do, and you can check a box on that to get on the mailing list. All four of my books now are available in audiobook form. I'm really glad that we got the fourth one finished. That this was just like a huge task to get all of these books into audiobook form, but I'm sort of an audiobook fan, and so anybody who likes listening to these things when you're driving to work or whatever, you can get all four books in audiobook form on Audible, and you can also get them in print form at the EAA bookstore, or Aircraft Spruce on Amazon. A podcast that I do with my colleagues Colleen Sterling and Paul New is now twice monthly. On the new episode of it comes out on the 1st and 15th of every month, and it's a call-in show. So we like really difficult stumper type maintenance questions. So if you have one of those, you're encouraged to email your question to podcast@aopa.org, and wonderful producer Ian Twombly will schedule you for one of our upcoming recording sessions so that you can participate in the podcast. And finally, the next 3 webinars that I will be doing on the first Wednesday of each month. The next one in October is entitled Why Annual Inspections, and I want to talk about how the regulations are different for little airplanes and bigger airplanes, and why King Airs don't have to have an annual inspection. In fact, they typically go through an inspection cycle every 2 years, not every 1 year. But for little airplanes, we can't do that. And I think maybe we ought to be allowed to do that, and I want to make an argument for that, but it would require a change in the regulations. Right now, the FAA basically treats bigger airplanes differently than little airplanes, and in my view, they treat bigger airplanes, at least in some ways, more leniently than they do little airplanes, which seems backwards to me. November, called Distrust and Verify, and really be talking about something that was in a way part of what we talked about tonight, which is the fact that mechanics have a tendency to deal with squawks by attacking the aircraft with tools rather than collecting data, and why it's really important for owners to stay on top of that in order to get a proper diagnosis before before any work is performed on the aircraft. And finally, in December, the webinar is called Concierge Maintenance, and I'll be talking about why I think the present business model for general aviation maintenance is broken, and what I think might be a better way to deal with the maintenance business model. Is an interesting subject that I'm kind of passionate about. So I hope you guys will consider attending these 3 webinars, and that's all I have for tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Excellent presentation. And to everybody who tuned in, thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.